Okay, my friend Mike G, tell me about the Ramones. We'll start with the Ramones in the 70s.
Well, the Ramones, I mean, that was the original punk rock band. I don't care what anybody says. There were bands that were making punk music before the Ramones and even called it that. But as far as what we call punk rock, that was the Ramones. They were band zero. That was the first punk rock band. And they were the ones that all the other groups in England, like the Sex Pistols, the Clash, Sham 69, they all patterned themselves off that. Although the difference between English punk and the Ramones was that English punk dealt with a very different subject matter. The Ramones, I admired the Ramones because they were kind of satirical. The Ramones were kind of making a commentary on how nihilistic and empty-headed American culture is. And they were actually making a perfect product to feed that need. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. But, you know, the Ramones really were the transition from heavy metal to punk. I mean, they were it. And I didn't really get into the Ramones that much when they were first out. I really only started to appreciate them later. But I will argue that that's punk rock band zero. Those are Ramones for sure.
Was like I Want to Be Sedated their biggest hit, you think? Or
I think Sheena's a Punk Rocker is probably their biggest hit. Because it came out on a single, and as an afterthought, they had to add it to their second album, Leave Home. That one, Sheena's a Punk Rocker, is even being used in commercials and stuff. So, you know, I would say that really would be their biggest hit. Although Want to Be Sedated is definitely up there. But let me just make a quick thing about that, though. I don't want to slight all the stuff that was their influences, though, because you had your Detroit bands like MC5 and Iggy and the Stooges. You had a band that, believe it or not, called themselves punk, but was the last thing you would think is a band called Suicide, which was just two guys. It was one guy on synthesizers, a drum machine, and another guy singing. It was Martin Rev and Alan Vega. And they were actually very old. They actually went back to like 71, 72. And they called them, see, New York had the germ of this punk thing going on the whole time. Some people feel that the Velvet Underground was the first punk band. I recently listened to White Light, White Heat, and I would say that, yeah, maybe, but if you're going to go to that, if you're going to say that, then you should really say that the Fugs were the first punk band, because I think that the Velvet Undergrounds wouldn't have done what they did had the Fugs not done what they did. And the Fugs were really kind of rooted in folk rock, believe it or not. Basically, the Fugs. Do you know the Fugs? Are you familiar?
No, but be careful how you say that.
I know. Well, that was the whole joke. F-U-G-S.
I know the Trogs.
The Fugs.
But, okay.
Yeah, no, and the Fugs were a kind of a very proto-social conscious. They had sort of that social consciousness of folk, but the nihilism of Velvets and punk. And they used to do things like get things out of a junkyard and bang on them. And believe it or not, they were an influence on John Lennon, too. Give Peace a Chance has a lot of Fugs influence in it. That kind of chanting, that kind of, unrepentant, unrelentless chanting, that's from the Fugs. And the Fugs were definitely an influence on Velvet Underground, too. Velvet Underground was a artsy version. They took the Fugs and kind of cleaned them up and made them arty, but it was the same music. It was the same idea.
So tell me about the Ramones making a movie.
Oh, well, Rock and Roll High School, yeah. And that's pretty, we were talking about bubblegum. I mean, that's pretty bubblegum. The Ramones, paid homage to bubblegum. I think they paid homage to a lot of good rock and roll. And yet we're kind of mocking it too, in a way. They were kind of mocking it retroactively, but also revering it. It's kind of hard to say. I think they did have a genuine appreciation for it. if you ever listen to End of the Century, which is the weird, ill-fated album that Phil Spector produced, it's very, it's very reverent to the girl groups and the early rock and Motown, and it. But
was that their best album? Are you saying?
No. As a matter of fact, it's their least Ramone album.
Okay.
It's a good record, but it's not really typical Ramones. There's some theories that in certain songs, Joey Ramone's the only Ramone playing on some of those tracks, and I think that's true. And yet, Phil Spector was a genius. He was a twisted genius, but he was a genius. There were a couple of tracks on End of the Century that Phil actually captured them at their punk rock best. And he did some things with the echo and the location and the reverb that was a little atypical of the Ramones sound, but he really caught them at their rawness too. He tried to do that wall of sound thing with them. And a couple of those tracks I think work. I think a couple of them are good, but the whole album is kind of an uneven hodgepodge of different things. Like Joey Ramone sings kind of like a ballad in one song, which is very atypical of their typical stuff. Yeah.
All right, next band, Devo.
Oh, well, please. Devo was the salvation of every misfit nerd in this country, or in the world, as a matter of fact, especially in the United States, though. I mean, Devo was one of those bands that when certain kids heard them, it was like angels were singing. Like, oh! It was like, wow. I mean, there's finally a rock band for us. They're not cool like Fleetwood Mac, and they're not all decadent and drugged out like Led Zeppelin or
Boston.
Foghat, or well, no, Boston was a little more technical, but but still, I mean, they didn't have that fey rock and roll decadence, and like, oh, we're so rock and roll, we drink so much and we do so many drugs, we're so cool. Devo was the first band for nerds, for kids that like wanted to do science experiments and wanted to sit there and program their computers and do things, and they were subversive, and they were very subversive. The irony, though, is that Devo were really hippies. They were witness to the tragedy at Kent State. They had already been headed a different direction, kind of a mutant direction anyway. But when that happened, that confirmed it. They just said, you know what? We're falling apart. Our society is completely mutating. People are mutating into something else. We're becoming stupid. We're becoming dependent on technology. We're losing our independence. We're losing our autonomy to corporations and technology. And their message was legit. I mean, I thought it was brilliant the way they combined, they cloaked their message in absolute stupidity, in absolute silly, nihilistic goofiness, but had a very serious message. And their listening to their music was actually enriching.
Were you surprised when they hit the top 40?
I don't know. Well, not really.
With Whip It.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, because I felt like in my mind they were already a top band anyway, so it was just a justification. It was just a sort of way of saying, see, everybody, used to call us fags, and they did. They used to call us fags for listening to Devo and all kinds of stuff. And it was kind of a justification, because these same people who were saying that about us were the same people walking around with Whip It t-shirts like, whip it, and like, yeah, really. And of course, Whip It, is a very wry, sarcastic mockery of so many things. The video is just touches on so many subjects. And those guys said so much with so little. It was amazing to me to this day.
Was the song Girl You Want also a hit?
Girl You Want was the lead. I think that was what they'd intended to be the lead-off track, the big hit. And, that's a very interesting song and video, because that song still taps into the older Devo. and it features Mark Mothersbaugh's father, who they called General Boy, who was supposed to be some kind of military leader with access to weird secrets. There's a scene in that video where there's a dancer doing kind of a pop locking kind of a thing on stage, and he's got these wires, and they follow the wires backstage, and General Boy is there controlling him with these, like they're hooked up to some weird box, and he's turning these knobs, and it's like he's controlling this guy. Very heavy statement for a 3-minute pop toss-off song.
Right.
Yeah, and of course that song was a lot of statements about the silliness of shows like American Bandstand and things like that, and the teenage pop culture thing. It was just so great.
In concert, did they move around or did they stay still?
Oh, no. Devo had a very tightly choreographed stage show. And I mean, you're sure they stood there like stock still, but they jumped around and pogoed around, and they had like synchronized things where they would, like during Uncontrollable Urge, they would kind of lurch towards the audience with each phrase of the chords, and they would take a step forward, No, they had all kinds of stuff. Devo was not a band that left much to chance. They were very well thought out.
And last band, B-52s.
Well, the B-52s were a real social innovation. And, the B-52s are an interesting band. Not many people know this, but with the exception of Cindy Wilson, every single member of that band was was homosexual. And, which I think we kind of knew at the time. We didn't know it to that extent, but that was another band that you could get your ass kicked for listening to. And there was definitely some events at school where some kids were playing the first side of the B-52's first album at Snack, and all of us were kind of hanging around listening to it. And then we see this sort of crust of a few jerks kind of yelling at us going, "Yeah." And then little by little, this crust becomes bigger and bigger and bigger until by the end of the Snack, we had almost the entire school, mostly male, surrounding us like antibodies trying to remove a virus or something, chanting, "Punk sucks, punk sucks," which is kind of ironic.
They weren't punk, were they?
B-52s weren't really punk. I mean, they were definitely a band that punks liked, and they were definitely new wave, but I wouldn't call them punk. But see, that's the way those kids thought back then. That's the way, if it wasn't Fleetwood Mac and it wasn't Led Zeppelin, it was punk, and so.
That's true. Okay, so the songs, Rock Lobster.
Yeah, oh, great. I mean, I listen to that song today. That song rocks hard. I mean, that song really, really gets frenetic. Especially the bridge at the end. That song is a darn good dance, and it is a rock song. Let us have it is not disco, it is not new wave or anything else. That is a rock and roll song, and it rocks hard. And it really, I think what they were trying to do was they were trying to take the best elements of the more kind of roller rinky kind of 60s songs and trying to update them, trying to give them that real rock adrenaline, that real rock, balls, for a better word, and still maintain that kitschy side, that 60s, kind of retro kitschy kind of thing, with the lyrics and such.
Now, they made the jump onto MTV in the 80s. Love Shack.
Later on. Yeah, Love Shack.
It took a while?
Because the album that they finally got MTV airplay on was like their fourth or fifth album.
Oh.
So, yeah, okay. No, they were not immediate. They were not received immediately by MTV. And Love Shack, a lot had changed in the band by then. Ricky Wilson had died, and he died of AIDS. And that changed the band. It changed the dynamic of the band, because after that happened, Keith Strickland, who was their drummer, changed to guitar, and they had studio musicians playing percussion and keyboards and stuff. And it had changed. It wasn't the original mix. I mean, I still like the B-52s of that period, but but it wasn't the real original B-52s. It had lost something, and that when Ricky Wilson died, a lot changed in the band. It was unfortunate.
And Rome, wasn't that a big video hit?
Yes, it was, and that's a good song.
Yeah.
I think Kate Pearson is an amazing singer. And I love that duet that she does with Iggy Pop, too, by the way. I think that's amazing. Candy.
Yeah, Candy.
Oh,
people have to listen to Candy.
And what I love about the B-52s, B-52s and Exene of X both have this thing where they deliberately sing off key, but it works somehow. There's a weird dissonance to it.
So she is off key. Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, and I think she knows she's doing it. It's not because she's too good a singer to not know. I think she kind of got it. Definitely Cindy Wilson, on the other hand, I don't know. I think she's just somehow they just made that work. But Kate Pearson is a very disciplined musician. She's a very good keyboard player, a darn good singer. But she does do this thing where she flattens her voice a little, and I don't know if that's deliberate or not, but
yeah,
but it works. It works. It's her characteristic thing.
And don't you think Iggy Pop deserved his moment in the sunlight?
Absolutely,
with Candy.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Because he's like the godfather of punk rock. I mean, his music was not exactly punk rock, but it definitely was the transition between the Detroit scene. See, people have to understand. You have to understand, there is a difference between psychedelic rock and acid rock. Okay, and it took me some time to understand this. Psychedelic rock was, like the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, and some of those frou-frou bands like Left Bank that wore the fancy ruffles and all that. But then you had acid rock, which was the down and dirty stuff. And even you mentioned the Trogs. Now the Trogs were even kind of they were drawing their influence more from the garage side of rock and roll. And but the MC5 and Iggy and the Stooges, that was acid rock. That was not psychedelic. It was a psychedelicized garage music taken to the next level. And of course it influenced bands like Suicide and the Ramones and the Velvet Underground and so forth and so on. So, it's funny how all of these things didn't just pop up in a vacuum. Everything kind of drew from something that came before it. But watching the transition is fascinating.
And last question, B-52s in concert, live?
I've seen them twice. And that is a party. Oh my God. I actually jumped over a fence to see them the first time. And I got there just at the end of the concert and just in time for them to do Rock Lobster. And man, that was worth it. That was worth every scratch and scrape I got.
Did they slam in the pit?
3 times. I've actually seen them 3 times. Yeah, but they do that to all kinds of stuff. They even do that to Kenny G nowadays. So who's to say? I mean, that doesn't. They didn't do that to them. They pogoed a lot though.
Pogo.
That was the big thing. Yeah. And they tried to do those silly dances, the aqua velva and the camel walk and all that. But nobody really knew what those dances were exactly.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.